Mickey 17's Donald Trump-like character is one of Bong Joon-ho's most effective villains. The following contains spoilers for Mickey 17, now playing in theaters. Mickey 17's main antagonist, Kenneth Marshall, is very reminiscent of United States President Donald Trump, which helps highlight why the character works as Bong Joon-ho's best villain so far. Mickey 17 is largely focused on the titular Mickey, an unfortunate worker bee in an intended space colony who is frequently killed and then cloned anew in the name of progress. Mickey's various deaths, and the conflict that arises when there are two versions of him at once, are just Mickey 17's surface-level story, as the thematic strength of the film is in its satirical riff on society. At the core of this criticism of politicians and the class politics is Kenneth Marshall, who has maintained a level of popularity and cult-like devotion within his followers, even while forcing them to endure frequently dangerous conditions on a distant planet. Marshall is a fairly broad character in design, someone that Joon-ho wanted to use as a universal parody of bad actors in political positions of power. However, there are some elements of the character that make it hard not to see Marshall as a direct riff on Trump, which plays into the thematic power of Mickey 17's explosive ending. Mickey 17's Kenneth Marshall might not have meant to be a parody of Donald Trump, but the similarities between the character and the real-life politician make the satirical aspects of the villain all the more effective. As reported by Screen Rant, Bong Joon-ho wasn't directly inspired by Donald Trump when writing the script to Mickey 17. Instead, Marshall was modeled after a mix of many different politicians. Joon-ho's intention was to create a character that would allow audiences from various nations to project their own leaders onto Marshall, highlighting the flaws that can be found in leaders around the world. This explains why the character of Marshall is a fairly broad parody instead of being too specific of a satirical character. While the image-obsessed leader does rely on television appearances to endear himself to the public, Marshall is also shown wearing the kind of military dress uniform that infamous world leaders use to try and make themselves appear intimidating and imposing. Marshall's volatile nature and telegraphed efforts to make himself seem impressive are reminiscent of countless politicians, making him a universal character. Mark Ruffalo's performance in Mickey 17 is where the comparison between Marshall and Trump feels more accurate. Ruffalo plays Marshall as a broad character, but there are aspects of the performance that feel reminiscent of Trump's public persona. Ruffalo adds a stilted touch to the character's dialogue and a habit of talking with his hands, delivering dialogue in a unique cadence that feels similar to the way that Trump speaks in public. The leader's obsession with maintaining control of any narrative through massaged news footage and TV shows is reminiscent of the ways Trump uses the media to his advantage. Marshall is established as having lost his most recent election when he makes the move to space, something that Ruffalo leans into for comedic effect that feels reminiscent of Trump refusing to admit his loss in the 2020 election. Even his efforts to look impressive are undercut by failures, recalling the publicity events for Donald Trump that have been ridiculed by certain corners of the public for their failed efforts to make the president look more impressive. Given Ruffalo's status as an American and his overt criticism of Trump in the past, this seems to have been a purposeful decision. Marshall follows a major trend in Bong Joon-ho films, which typically depict the wealthy and the politicians who work with them as the main antagonists of their respective stories. The host in Okja may have monstrous frogs in Seoul or genetically modified pigs, but the actual antagonists of those films are governments covering up their mistakes or the companies manipulating science for profit. The villains of Snowpiercer are the upper class who have thrived while the lower classes work themselves to death, a clear takedown on governments that shares an overall thematic view of those in power with Mickey 17. While Parasite benefited from a very specific perspective, Marshall being a broader parody of world leaders gives Mickey 17 a more broadly appealing satirical element. Mickey 17 keeps that focus largely on Marshall and his wife, with his followers relegated to background roles as opposed to Snowpiercer's larger cast of adherents to the train's way of life. The Marshall's disgust with Mickey and other low-class citizens is reminiscent of how Parasite shows the upper class can treat the lower classes as subhumans, setting up their own downfall.